Hello, my name is Rachael Milwid and I'm a postdoc at McGill University. Today I'm going to be discussing my mathematical model of HIV transmission dynamics amongst gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors without whom this work would not have been possible, as well as the study participants from the August, Engage, and Rachael studies. This work was funded by the Canadian Foundation for AIDS Research, as well as CIHR. In 2019, 65% of Quebec's new diagnoses were reported in Montreal. Of these, the majority occurred amongst men, of which about 70% occurred amongst MSM. Now, in 2017, Montreal became the first Canadian city to join the Fast Track Cities initiative, meaning that they took on the goal of achieving 0 new HIV infections by 2030. Now, in order to achieve this goal, it's necessary to develop a public health plan, but this is often complicated by the continual evolution and interaction of the HIV prevention landscape, which includes condom use, HIV testing, HIV treatment, post-exposure prophylaxis, and pre-exposure prophylaxis. Now, many mathematical models have been used to characterize the epidemic and the impact of all of these prevention strategies, but to date, few have been developed for Montreal MSM. So having said that, the purpose of this work is to develop an agent-based model in order to characterize the HIV epidemic as well as describe the epidemic drivers. And we did this using data from 3 biobehavioral surveys. The August survey is a venue-based convenience sampling survey which recruited men aged 18 years and older who had reported having sex with another man within their lifetime. The Engage survey used respondent-driven sampling to recruit men aged 18 years and older who reported having sex with another man within the past 6 months. And finally, we used data from the Rachael survey to inform the PrEP module for the model. We made an agent-based model which combined partnership dynamics such as partnership formation and dissolution with the natural history of HIV and the HIV care cascade. So very briefly, upon acquiring an HIV, men progress through decreasing CD4 cell counts. And men can die from either natural or age-related infection at any time during the natural history of HIV. Men can get tested for HIV, and upon a positive diagnosis, eligible men go on ART. ART eligibility was modeled in line with the local time varying ART eligibility criteria. When men discontinue ART, they continue to progress through the natural history of HIV. Additionally, we modeled PrEP and PEP. So we modeled the probability of HIV transmission within a serodiscordant partnership as a function of the HIV positive partner's stage of infection and ART status, the HIV negative partner's sex role, PrEP use, and PEP use, and the number of sex acts within the partnership and the proportion of those sex acts that were protected by a condom. We used approximate Bayesian computation sequential Monte Carlo fitting methods to fit the model to Montreal level data. I haven't included all of the outcomes here, but I just wanted to give you an idea and to show you that the model actually fit the data really well. So on the left, you can see our calibration outcome of the age-stratified prevalence. The blue lines are the simulations and the red is the data, and we're hitting that pretty spot on. In terms of calibration targets, we wanted to see that the model could reproduce or correctly predict measures such as incidence and the proportion with a viral load suppression. So I'm going to start by characterizing the HIV epidemic in terms of the annual incidence, prevalence, and mortality. And we looked at both the overall, the age stratified, and the sexual partnering level stratified measures. So with respect to incidence, the incidence peaked in 1985 at about 2% and decreased to 0.2% in 2017. When we looked at the age stratified incidence, we noticed that the 35 to 44-year-old men who had an incidence of 2 to 3 times that of men aged 15 to 24 years. And finally, incidence ratio between the high sexual partnering group and the low sexual partnering group ranged between 8 and 13 between 1975 and 1985, and 5 to 7 thereafter. With respect to prevalence, the prevalence peaked in 1990 at about 13%, and decreased for all strata thereafter, except for the oldest age group, which due to the introduction of art, which prolongs the life of people living with HIV, people continually age into this age group. So the oldest age group continues to increase in prevalence. Finally, with respect to mortality, the introduction of art in 1996 resulted in a steep drop in mortality and a corresponding drop in incidence and prevalence. So before I continue, I want to make a quick note that from now on, when I talk about the proportion, we're talking about the annual number of strata-specific acquisition or transmission events out of the total number of annual acquisition or transmission events. So having said that, we looked at the proportion of acquisitions and transmissions by sexual partnering level, and we see that the majority of acquisitions occur amongst men in the higher partnering levels, but 30% of acquisitions occur amongst men in the lower partnering levels. And this is important as it speaks to the need and the importance of the continual promotion of HIV prevention strategies, such as PrEP, for men in all risk groups. Next, we looked at the impact of HIV stage on transmission, and we noticed an increase in the primary stage of infection on incidence and a decreasing role of the late stage. And this is likely attributable to the increasing proportion on ART over time, decreasing the proportion who actually progress to the late stage of infection. Finally, we looked at the impact of knowledge of status and ART on transmission. So I'm going to start with the proportion of all people living with HIV that were unaware of the HIV status, and this decreased over time, such that by 2017, about 3% were unaware of their status. Now, we saw a decrease in time of people unaware of their status at the time of transmission, such that by 2017, about 36% were unaware of their status. While this sounds like a lot, you need to keep in mind the high proportion with knowledge of status and the very low incidence in the later years. With respect to ART status, the proportion living with HIV who were on ART increased over time. And in 2017, over 90% of all people living with HIV were on ART. However, we saw an analogous increase in the proportion on ART at the time of transmission. And in 2017, about 25% of transmission events occurred amongst people on ART. And this is just to say that those people did not have a fully suppressed viral load. We saw decreases in the proportion who had dropped ART or who had never been on ART. And in 2017, about 50% of transmission events occurred amongst people who had never been on ART. The study does not come without its limitations. So first of all, we had minimal data from the early epidemic stages. And although our model fit the data pretty well, it's really challenging to make inferences from this early time period. There was also some differences in the survey questions between surveys. And so we used statistical methods such as standardization to ensure the representative and comparability of the data. And finally, the low incidence in recent years resulted in large credible intervals, making it challenging to quantify the impact of some of the drivers of the epidemic. So we've seen a declining incidence in recent years, which really speaks to the feasibility of accomplishing the fast track initiatives. And through this work, we were able to pinpoint core groups and prevention gaps, or gaps in the prevention of HIV, I should say, such as a substantial acquisition amongst individuals in the lower sexual partnering groups, which again just indicates a necessity of the continual promotion of HIV prevention strategies to all risk groups. We also noticed the increasing role of the primary stage of infection in HIV incidence, and this combined with the high proportion who are unaware of the HIV status at the time of transmission indicates a necessity for increased HIV testing frequency. So all of these together serve as a starting point for informing future elimination protocols. So just a super quick comment about where we're going next is we're going to use this model to assess the impact of different prevention combination strategies in achieving HIV elimination. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions.